This is an online presentation that was originally given in Preston in England recently, and because of some sound problems that took place on the video recording, people have asked me if I could redo it in this format in order so they can follow the topic more clearly. And so that's the purpose of this slideshow, so I can convey the topics without the interference that was sadly appeared on the microphone from the Preston show. So anyway, this is called Folklore and Ancient Sites. What does it tell us about the past, megaliths, and other ancient locations? This came about as a result of trying to find out if there was any kind of continuum of lineage from the ancient Neolithic and Bronze Age sites and up to present or past folklore, which I undertook for my book The Druid Code. I was trying to establish if in fact, prior to the Druids of the Celtic era and similar groups, were they the inheritors of a proto-shamanic tradition that went back much further into the time of the stone monuments were being built. And if so, did their folklore transfer into modern folklore? And by modern folklore I mean within the last 200-300 years. And how far could we go back in time in order to perhaps uncover a lexicon into why builders of the ancient past built these stone circles in the particular places they did. Now the first question is, when we look at things like fairy tales and folk stories and folk traditions, is how old are these stories? Well, they're remarkably ancient, surprisingly so. A research program undertaken by universities in Portugal and in the UK using gene analysis techniques normally used in botany to detect strains of plants and vegetables and how they branched off towards different genetic mutations was applied towards fairy tales and folk traditions and stories. Certain key words were used and key phrases and key concepts were placed within these computer programs in order to find out how far back they go. Remarkably, the researchers discovered that they go back at least as far as the Bronze Age and even further. Some stories, such as Jack and the Beanstalk, and we'll be talking about giants a little later on, is a tremendously ancient story, as are any stories to do with smiths and things going wrong. A smith making a mistake, a smith being punished, a smith having an accident within the forgery. Most notably, we know this from the Nordic saga of Thor and why the hammer Mjolnir had less longer handle than it was supposed to have because a horsefly bit one of the dwarf craftsmen while he was forging the hammer. This idea of something going wrong with the smith or something going wrong in the creation of metalwork goes back at least as far as the Bronze Age. In Ireland we have things called Raths or fairy forts. This one here is in Rathcrogan in County Roscommon in Ireland. Judging by that 2-lane road next to it, to give you an idea of how large these things are. They're not all this size, in fact some are even bigger than this one. But in general they'd be smaller than this one, about half the size of them. And there's about 40 to 50,000 of these were built in Ireland, of which about 30,000 still remain. And they are dotted all over the Irish landscape and are always in this circular form. Sometimes they are in multi-ring form, where you would have concentric rings leading towards a raised area in the centre. They were built in Ireland over a tremendously long period of time, from the Neolithic all the way up until the early Middle Ages. So you're talking a span of thousands of years that these were a central part of communal ritual and agricultural infrastructure within Ireland. Now, when I was growing up in school, they used to tell us that the purpose of these circular enclosures were to protect livestock. While that may have been the case later on in the Middle Ages, when they could afford properly armed troops and so on to circumnavigate the exterior, because you could easily raid one of these enclosures. As a fort, they're useless. You could throw a rock over them. So this leads us to another purpose. Why are they always a circle? And the obvious answer is they're ceremonial. The ancients were obsessed, particularly in the Celtic world and before, with the concept of an area having a circle. Not as a square, but always a circle. Now, these are brought into this presentation because they are loaded with folklore, particularly regarding not going into them to disturb the fairies. Within Irish folklore, there's a story that when the Tuatha Danann was defeated by the Milesian Gaels, they retreated into the ancient megalithic and similar structures around Ireland until they were to be called again to rescue Ireland during its time of darkness. This led later on to a belief that within these enclosures the fairies, and often malicious fairies, were inside them. Particularly at Halloween, Samhain, children were told, and adults, to go nowhere near the fairy fort or the fairy ring, as you would come into contact with fairies and they would most certainly abduct you, and you probably never would be allowed to return to this reality. Often by nature and left alone. You can see it here somewhat on the left hand side of this picture. Hawthorn trees and blackthorn trees were allowed to grow around the circumference, these trees in Ireland being very much associated with the fairies. To this day, many of the people in Ireland will not build or go anywhere near these things for fear of invoking the wrath of the fairies. In fact, roads will often be diverted because there's long been a belief that when a road passes through a fairy fort, it will be a place of constant accidents and death. The folklore connected to these is nearly always a warning not to trespass upon the fairy domain. Now, coupling that with the story within Irish mythology of the Tuatha Danann being banished to this area, we probably have a direct link to something akin to an earlier migration in Ireland telling their children do not go into certain parts of the country, particularly where these rings are located, because the other people are there. It may even go back as far as Indo-European invasion, and these rings originally being created by, or these fairy forts or Raths, originally having been created by the indigenous Europeans who existed prior to the Indo-European invasion or migration, and who built the original stone structures of Europe, such as Stonehenge, Newgrange, Everett, Karnak, and so on. So we have a very distinct link from the past to the present with these Raths or fairy forts, showing the tenacity of folklore in its ability to survive over thousands and thousands of years. Another sideline to this is, having studied these things since I was a young teenager, one thing I discovered was, if you have a situation such as the road at the bottom has wild strawberries or blackberries growing along the hedgerow, wherever they come into close contact with the fairy fort, you will find that I have found that the yield of strawberries and blackberries, as well as rose hips, is often much, much higher than either the approach road or the departure road on either side of it. Wherever wild strawberries or wild blackberries grow, in the circumference around these, there are always very large and fruitful trees. Now, perhaps these circular enclosures may be connected in a sense to what Philip Callaghan discovered with the round towers and megaliths of Ireland, that they actually work as a kind of a fertility or soil conditioning machine. In Portugal, there's a place called Évora, and around it there are some substantial and very impressive Neolithic stone circles and other standing stones such as the menhir on the left. On a raised elevated site atop of an aquifer, what makes these impressive structures so interesting is that the folklore surrounding them concerns something called the Mouras Encantadas, which is a female witchcraft tradition associated with both the building of these megaliths at Evora and also the jurisdiction or the stewardship of them and the traditions connected to them right up to the present. What makes the Mouras Encantadas story so interesting is that during the Islamic Caliphate of Iberia, when this part of Portugal was under Islamic control of the Moorish Empire, the Mouras Encantadas tradition continued with Islamic women. The folklore and the gravitas associated with this female power of these women being such that even within Islam they were not only tolerated but encouraged. In fact, the menhir on the left is associated with the story of an Islamic witch, believe it or not. And this concept of the Mouras Encantadas continues to the very present. Again, we have a link way back to the ancient past that was continued through varying Abrahamic traditions, showing and giving testimony to the power of the concept and the story itself. This is the Bohea Stone in County Mayo in Ireland. These stones, are connected with access to the fairy world from this world. And these cup and ring circular marks are also very common in Scandinavian and Karelian and Russian megalithic rock art. The belief is that one places a seed into the cup in the middle of the concentric circles, or if the cup is singular on its own, and it's gifted as a gift to the fairy world. Now, what makes this one more interesting at the Bohea Stone in County Mayo is that it was discovered that if you stand on this stone and look towards the sacred mountain of Croagh Patrick, originally called Croagh Crom, after the last pagan god of Ireland, you can see the sun rising and rolling up the side of the mountain on the day of the planting and down the other side on the day of the harvesting. Now that's a clear-cut silver bullet to the truth of the past here, because obviously the people who created these cup and ring marks upon this stone used their ceremony in order for their planting and harvesting cycles. And this shows the antiquity of these stories. This would be a classic example of a folklore tradition that had been missing and was rediscovered in modern times. But again, this is a 5,000 at least year old megalith, showing again the endurance and the testimony to how long these stories will last when they're connected to sacred sites. This is a place called near Andrahapura, the sacred Buddhist city in central Sri Lanka, and it's known locally as a Stargate. It's a remarkable rock carving with a concentric circle in the middle, which is believed to allow the meditative person to pass between different dimensions. And many Hindu people come to Sri Lanka, from around Sri Lanka and from India, to meditate in front of this rock. In fact, the day I took this photograph, I met an Indian tourist gentleman who was doing just that. And when he came out and spoke to me, he told me that he was shown all his past lives within this meditation experience. Literally transported out of himself and out of space-time reality. This is built in an area now associated with Buddhism in central Sri Lanka. And unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, you have a similar situation that you had with the Christians within Europe, in that they declared any kind of previous religious or spiritual tradition to be devil worshippers or demon worshippers, and were told to discount these things. So it's a good thing that this actual Stargate in Sri Lanka has remained to the present, as it gives us one more clue of how long and enduring these stories last. You have the Buddhist temples built very close to this, suggesting that the Buddhists themselves, like so much Christian sites, particularly in England, built themselves upon ancient pagan and pre-Celtic sites. There is also some fascinating large structures which I believe are yet to be discovered as dolmens in the area. This is on Delph Island, which is between India and Sri Lanka, in the middle of the ocean. It takes quite a long boat ride to get there, very uncomfortable. When you arrive there, one of the highlights is this growing Cobra Stone, which is a stone which has been growing out of the ground of Delph Island, which is basically all coral reef, and this seems to be a granite type stone, which over the last 70 or so years has grown to the height it is now. This creates the stone as a religious and sacred place for Hindus. There's a Hindu temple right beside it, and it also which venerates the Nagas, which are the underground serpents which live below the earth. You can see behind me there how big the thing is. It's about at its height now, about 5 feet, just over 5 feet off the ground. But it has been continually recorded as growing out of the ground and is worshipped as a result. So here we have an actual culture which is venerating the megalithic structures of Delph Island in the same way that our ancient ancestors venerated the ancient stones of Europe and so on. Now this brings up another question. The reason for this stone having been considered religious or supernatural is because of its ability to push itself out of the ground over the years. It does make one wonder if this is how stones that have become part of the megalithic world that were actually glacial erratics, and by that I'm thinking of Uisneach, the cat stone in the centre of Ireland, which we were told is a glacial erratic. Did a similar phenomena happen there? Did the stone push itself out of the ground? There is also the phenomenon of the trovants, which are moving sandstone boulders which actually move across the landscape of parts of Romania. And these stones have been cut in half, and you look inside and there's just nothing in there except concentric rings like a tree, but it's all made of sandstone. What we're dealing with is a living stone, and it's one of these things is kept very quiet in the media. You're never shown a Discovery or a BBC channel or National Geographic documentary about the trovants of Romania, because these moving stones that apparently breathe when it rains and move across the landscape, living stones, are a complete affront to Darwinian evolutionary theory. They should not exist, yet they do. Stones that live and move. And we wonder how much of the trovant type experience played a part in the veneration of stones in the ancient world. Could it be possible that when you see the stones at Evora, that they were actually corralled into position and remained there, as if they were almost like herded animals? Now, when we talk about folklore and stories concerning the megaliths, we're always confronted with giants. We're always confronted with the giants, the concept of the giants. It comes up everywhere, most notably in Malta and Sardinia, but not always just there, everywhere. It'll be called a giant's grave, a giant's stack, a giant's temple, a giant's altar. It appears everywhere. These are two locations here. The one at the top is the Temple of Gigantea on the island of Gozo near Malta. Absolutely colossal stones. Gigantea means giant in Maltese. And in Malta there are stories surrounding giants being living on the islands before the first Homo sapiens arrived from Sicily. And within the Maltese folklore, the stories are very similar to Jack and the Beanstalk, in that the humans deceive and lie, rob and steal from the giants and eventually destroy them. It almost is like there's a guilt memory within Maltese culture of the Homo sapiens having arrived from Sicily, fooled the giants. A common story is giants being made to eat too much pasta, and then after they fed them, they're too tired to get up, and then the Homo sapiens murder them. Very similar again to the Jack and the Beanstalk, a similar kind of concept. And so we have a very close association with the giants culture and the numerous and impressive huge megaliths of Malta. Conversely, in Sardinia, another Mediterranean island that's absolutely covered from top to bottom in very impressive megaliths, you have the same concept of a certain type of neuragic monument, an enclosure that looks very similar to an Irish court cairn, being called a giant's grave. In fact, that's me standing on top of a mountain in Sardinia. The question that really comes about from all this is how those stones, which were quarried at the bottom of the mountain, were brought up all the way to the top of this mountain to build this so-called giant's grave. In fact, they look from the top, these shapes, very much like the head of a bull, and bull veneration seems to be very central to not only the neuragic culture who built these megaliths in the Bronze Age within Sardinia, but all through the Proto-European world. In fact, Sardinians have the highest level of DNA from the Proto-Europeans still remaining in modern Europeans. But again, if you've been to Sardinia and the central interior area, it's literally made up of stones the size of bowling balls. It's a difficult landscape to even navigate across on foot. And yet these large stones were taken from the bottom of the valley of this mountain I'm standing on top of and brought all the way up to be assembled after they were quarried on top of the mountain. And again, we're told it was giants. Now this leads us all to the other things. It's not a new phenomena. This is an emerging and constantly growing thing. And we see this with less ancient sites. On the right there, you have the sandback crosses in Congleton and Cheshire in England, which I began the opening scenes of my movie, Who Stole the Allfather, which you can see on this channel. And within these two crosses, which go back to the time of King Penday, who was the son of the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, of Mercia, King Penda. And along the sandback crosses are images of both what we seem to be Christian and pagan imagery. Now, this comes from a period of within Anglo-Saxon culture during this changeover from paganism and into Christianity of a genre known as dream poetry. And these are known as dream stories on the carvings on these crosses, which don't look Christian at all. They look more akin to something like a pagan idol. In fact, a wooden one of these, or similar, was dug up from a bog in Ireland recently, going back to the early Bronze Age, which was very similar in shape to what we're looking at here. They almost look like totem poles. So it shows you we don't really know when the crossover between Christianity and paganism happened. But things like the sandback crosses show us a continuum that went back into pagan times of a certain type of art form, dream poetry, and also a graphical and a design aspect that went back probably into the very ancient world, but we don't have it because it may have been carved on perishable materials such as wood and leather. Although we do have many ancient objects in places like the National Museum in Ireland that are beautifully intricate, that go well back into the Bronze Age. mostly made in gold and silver. And to the left of that is an image of St. Winifred's Well in Flintshire in Holywell in Wales. And this is, again, a typical thing that carries on all through this story. Holy wells are a direct link back to the very ancient past. Often holy wells are often, in recent times, associated with a female saint who would not convert to Christianity, and the well came up as a result of her being killed or creating a magical spell and so on. And this is what happens at Flintshire. There's a saint there that was believed to have been decapitated, and where a head fell is where this sprouted from. But these were venerated long back into the ancient past. So when people go to these holy wells today, they're taking part in a worship of the ancient waters that has gone back through the Christian area, through in the Romano-pagan area of Minerva and so on, and Athena, way through to the Celtic era of the holy sacred wells of the Druids, and into prior cultures we don't know about, or proto-shamanic situations and lifestyles that also worshipped these sacred waters. So it has never left us. It has been a continuing, never-ending story. If you would like to know more about this, please check out my book, The Druid Code, which you can get online just about anywhere, and it extrapolates much more deeply upon the subjects outlined within this slideshow. Thank you.